Hello and welcome to ATARC's webinar series. Today, we will hear insights from topic experts on what it takes to build a proper network baseline to ensure that all valid use cases are accounted for. My name is Kirsten Patton, and I will be moderating today's webinar. ATARC stands for the Advanced Technology Academic Research Center. ATARC is a nonprofit that facilitates collaboration between government, industry, and academia in order to accelerate technology modernization initiatives. ATARC provides ongoing opportunities for cross-agency collaboration through on-site interaction, learning, and market research. I would like to welcome all of our attendees, and ATARC would also like to give a special thanks to the CoreLight team, specifically Edward Smith, Aaron Hazard, James Campbell, Roger Cohol, and Jean Schaefer. Before we begin, I just want to remind our audience to please answer all of the poll questions as we go throughout today's webinar in order to ensure that you receive your CPE credits. And also remember to send in any audience questions that you may have through the Q&A section of this platform. Now, with that said, I would like if each of our panelists could please come on camera and come off mute, and we will do a round of brief introductions. So please share with us who you are, what agency you're with, what role you have at that agency, and anything else you'd like to share with our audience up top. Dan, let's start with you, please.
Sure, thanks, Kirsten. My name's Dan Chandler. I'm the Chief Information Security Officer for OMB. I would like to clarify that I'm responsible for OMB's internal systems. The Office of the Federal CIO is also part of OMB, and they're responsible for federal-wide IT policy. So anything OMB has done that may have upset you is not my fault, and you shouldn't hold it against me.
Thank you, Dan. Let's move over to Lawrence next.
Hello, my name is Lawrence Sanderson. I serve in two roles at the Department of Commerce. One is the CIO for the Office of the Secretary, but I'm also the Deputy CIO for the Office of Shared Services and Solutions at the Department of Commerce, where I help to administer and moderate the $3.9 billion investment for the Department of Commerce. So that's kind of my dual role there. So I'm happy to be here today. That's all I have.
Thank you. Bo, let's move over to you next.
Hey, Kirsten, I'm not sure what's happening with my camera. I may drop in a second and rejoin, but Bo Hauser, I'm the Chief Information Security Officer at the Census Bureau. I work closely with Larry in that role and at Census. I've been here coming up on 3 years. Before Census, I was over at the Small Business Administration as the CISO. And then prior to that, I was at the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services as the Deputy CISO. So we're certainly in the throes of wrestling with the Zero Trust mandate. So I'm really looking forward to today's discussion.
Fantastic, thank you. And let's move over to Brian next.
Hey, good afternoon. I'm Brian Herman. I'm the Director of Cybersecurity and Analytics at the Defense Information Systems Agency. So we provide cybersecurity tooling for the Department of Defense. We're responsible for a number of things that we call enabling capabilities, but also what we're implementing for Zero Trust, which we call Thunderdome. So I'll talk a little bit more about how that plays into what we're trying to accomplish across the department.
Wonderful, thank you. Sam.
Hi, thanks for having me. I'm Sam Michael. I'm the Chief of the Information Technology Resource Branch at NCATS. We're the National Center for Advancing Translational Sciences as part of NIH, the National Institutes of Health. My role here is really to provide access to secure collaborative platforms, either physical, as in high throughput screening, so robotic systems, or virtual for virtual research organizations. And really interested in hearing what this panel has to say with regards to Zero Trust and how we can walk that line between maintaining it, but also ensuring we can actually have work get done.
Fantastic, thank you. And Jean.
Hi, I'm Jean Schaefer. I'm the Federal CTO for CoreLight. Prior to joining CoreLight about 2 years ago, I actually retired from the intelligence community, where I held the role of CISO at DIA, as well as managing their JWICS network. Prior to that, I was at NSA, where I spent about 30 years working various different offices on both the defensive and the offensive side, including contributing to and helping some of the principles of the Zero Trust strategy as it was being developed.
Fantastic. Well, thank you all for being here and providing us with those introductions. So on to my first question, and a little bit of context to this question. The basis of a zero trust architecture is to have positive control of who is accessing the information, systems, and assets of an organization to ensure that only authorized users are permitted access. Identity management and endpoint protection are absolutely required. But Dan, I would like to pose this question to you first. How do you ensure that they are being used effectively? So could you please speak to your perspective and your experience with that?
Yeah, it's a really great question to start out with, because it really is that identity management piece is really core and fundamental to anything you're going to do in zero trust. If you don't know who's on the other end of the line, you can't possibly implement any of the other principles of zero trust. You also have to take into account how sure you are about the other person on the other end of the line, that level of assurance that's associated with an identity. So in the federal government, we're very fortunate to have access to a really strong two-factor identity solution in our PIV cards or CAC. And so leveraging those for your identity management and for your authentication is a really, really strong first step that gets you that makes it a lot easier to implement future components of the zero trust architecture. The other zero trust principle that you really want to focus on implementing is a single source of truth for your identity and access management. So, you really want to have a service in your environment that is the one place that all of your systems are going to go to verify that a particular person should have access to a particular function or feature. And you want to do that obviously with role-based access controls. So rather than having lots of individual systems that have their own group structures or their own interface for managing permissions, you really want to have a single tool that's part of your identity management solution that lets you control who a person, lets you identify who a person is and what roles that person has. And then in the individual systems, all they have to do is implement access controls and security controls based on the roles that a person has. And you're going to implement lots of other features within your architecture to make sure by the time a request gets to that system, you have a really strong level of assurance of who that person is and what roles they have.
Thank you, Dan, for kicking us off there. So now I just want to open it up to our other panelists online. If you're interested in responding, you can go ahead and come off mute. I saw Brian waved his hand. Brian, go ahead.
Yeah, so I agree with what Dan said. We have done a lot of work over the past few years for ICAM in the Department of Defense. One of our challenges is that we're actually big enough to need federation. So we base our identity information on that single source of truth, but we sometimes feed other ICAM solutions and then have a federation requirement. And that federation requirement is tough enough within the Department of Defense. I think the next step, the thing that we have to work out is the federation among us in the federal government to make sure that we can work across the entire federal space so that the CAC versus PIV is not our problem. But then we're also looking at how we do that, have an appropriate level of trust for our allied and coalition partners, and that's a much more tricky thing than trusting among our federal teammates. And then finally, when we implemented Office 365 last year, one of the things that we did was what we call Flow 3, which I think is a good use case for these ICAM enabling technologies. So we knew who users were as long as users were logging in with their approved identity solution. We also took a look at what their device was. Is their device a managed Department of Defense computer, or is it something else? And where is it located? Where is it coming from on the commercial network? and we limited the amount of access so that if you use your personal computer, but you use your own proper identity, you're actually able to access and view your calendar, your email, and that kind of thing. But you can't download and you can't print. So we limit exfiltration. Those are the kinds of policy things that we need to use on all of our applications, make smart decisions about how we enable those applications to use the enabling technology to make the right decisions.
So Brian, I 100% agree across the board with all of that. The one other thing that I want to kind of interject that I think is important when you're implementing all of that is a double check on the reality of what's happening, right? So if we're coming back to some of the question about do you use any of the network evidence, what I want to point out is that's actually where you can verify, right, that what you are implementing from both an identity point of view as well as right authorized devices and where they're coming from. You really need to take that into account and monitor that and make sure what you think you've implemented is actually the reality. Because as we all know, that's kind of where our adversaries have been successful in the past. And so that's kind of a key piece of that entire zero trust strategy from the foundation up.
Yeah, and if I could add something, agree with all those points, and I do think Dan kicked us off great. And Brian, you just mentioned federation, which is incredibly important for us because at NIH, many of our customers, so at NCATS, we have the largest grant program in all of NIH, which is the CTSA program. So it's 60 universities across the country, and many of the folks that access our systems are actually academics. And so we rely heavily on federation, in particular Internet 2 and in common, because without that, we couldn't exist. But we also want to make sure, to the point Dan made, that we have that single source of truth. So one of the things we decided to invest in was generating our own federated authentication platform. We call it UNA, so Unified NCATS Auth. So essentially every system that we connect goes through UNA for both the authentication of who they are, but also the authorization of what they have access to. And I agree completely with what Dan said as well with regards to the assurance level, because it's been really important for us to implement in some cases assurance level 2, especially with outside parties. They don't have CAC or a PIV card, but they actually, in this case, have prevalent use of multi-factor authentication, again, apps, whatever you want to use, Authy, Google, in that case, Azure, which is letting the academics really use that multi-factor authentication. They've actually adopted very well. So it's a really fundamental piece of zero trust.
Let's go Lawrence and then back to Dan.
Yeah, just on what two points that Brian mentioned, I wanted to just talk about a little bit, and that actually brought in Dan. It's the single source of truth, and that's the thing that we spent the most time on is figuring out what that is going to be and how information flow, what systems we're going to trust. Like we have travel systems, we have HR systems, we have financial systems, right? And we have even a security system at the Department of Commerce, right? Where we emergency notification system, all these systems. Where we had to, took us kind of several months to kind of get an understanding of and an agreement between the parties in terms of what we're going to accept as a single source of truth. And then getting then to Brian mentioned policy, and we haven't talked a lot about that, but I think that's one of the things that we're running into challenges with, is that this stuff is all new for everybody. So when we bring on new applications, what is the policy? Are you going to require them to comply, both internally, but particularly with federated organizations, and also as we start to use external applications? GovTA, for example, is going to be replacing our WebTA system and requiring those vendors who provide these applications to us, either vendors or other government agencies, compliance with our ICAM solutions or our identity management solution. I know we've been talking a lot about identity management, not zero trust, but you have to get that part together first. So really, this 80% of this conversation really, to me, is about identity and understanding who these people are and how you're going to manage that via policy-wise.
Thank you. Dan?
Yeah, I think those are all really, really good points. I'm glad the conversation is flowing this way. One of the things that kind of sparked in my mind as everybody was discussing is, a lot of conversations I've had with different architects about zero trust. One of the things that a lot of people, I think, miss out on is that your system that is determining whether or not somebody has access to a resource must be dynamic. and it must incorporate all of the information available within the network in making those dynamic decisions. So, for example, one of the things that we talk about a lot is if somebody is authenticating using Google Authentication or AWS or Microsoft Azure, we may trust those authentications to different extents at different times based on things that are going on in the world. The day after a 0-day vulnerability in one of those services is revealed, our trust for that authentication system may go down by 10 or 20 or 40%. So we're actually working on kind of architecting a system that creates a trust score for a particular session and matches that up against a trust requirement on a function or feature, so that we really have that dynamic kind of very granular change in the level of trust we have to a particular session, and we can guide that user to say, okay, you want to do this thing, for whatever reason your trust score isn't quite high enough, why don't you re-authenticate or put in your PIP card or whatever in order to raise that score up enough for you to be able to do this thing. And doing that dynamically is a really key feature. And if you do it dynamically, it kind of forces you to do a lot of other best practices as well.
Thank you, Dan. Any other comments from the panelists before we move on? All right, thank you guys for jumping right in. This is a great discussion. Let's put up our poll question number 1 first, and then I will ask our second question. So poll question number 1 up on the screen. What is your biggest challenge in building your zero trust strategy? So please go ahead and respond to that, whether it be funding, knowledgeable staff members, manpower, competing priorities, or lack of strong network visibility. And I am going to check the Q&A. Let's see here, Timothy Wallace. GSA is promoting login.gov for authentication for a citizen and outside partner and developer access across agencies. Is this insufficient for internal agency access? Go ahead, Lawrence.
Yeah, I can take a crack at that. It's not insufficient. I don't think it's cost effective for internal access. So we are doing an either or approach. We generally, and this is both when I was here at the Department of Commerce, but also when I was at OPM, we implemented login.gov for the USA suite of applications, USA Performance, USA Staffing. Of course, most of you who are federal employees recognize USA Jobs. The first thing you'll see is that login.gov interface that we implemented when I was at OPM as Associate CIO. We looked at and did an analysis of alternatives in both places, both here and at Department of Commerce and at OPM. And cost-wise, for the amount of users that was on, it just didn't make sense for us to implement that. And so you can't have two solutions. So I mean, they both work, but just in terms of the overhead associated with trying to implement login.gov for internal users, we didn't think that was the best path, and also it didn't leverage essentially the existing PIV and CAC infrastructure that you currently have already in place. We already have people who have things, right? Remember the principle of you have something that right, and or something that you own. Well, we have that already in place for federal employees, contractors, and volunteers. You don't have that for external folks, so it makes most sense to leverage your existing infrastructure and architecture that's already in place.
Thank you, Lawrence. Let's go Sam and then Dan.
Yeah, really quick as an add-on there. I think it's a great question. And again, it also depends upon the mission. In Lauren's case, it didn't make sense. For our case, where we mentioned the academic networks, there are universities that aren't part of InCommon. And so we needed a means to actually have authentication in, and login.gov was a great solution. So we use it at NIH because for our use case, internal actually implies potentially research or access. And so it's been a good solution.
Great. Dan?
Yeah, I would just, login.gov is a really great service, and it has the capability to support PIP card authentication. One of the things you have to consider when you're leveraging a service like that, though, is how you incorporate it into your system. So, for example, if you're using login.gov as a SAML provider, you can, within your own systems, require that the person be logged in with a PIP card, to require that that SAML assertion indicate that they logged in using a PIP card or whatever level of strong two-factor authentication you want. So it's not that login.gov is insufficient, but there's some things you have to do on your side in order to get it up to the level of security that you would want for an internal system. Now, if it's a system that you have external, non-government users using, then you've already kind of set the bar of what the security level is going to be. So using something like login.gov for that is a very reasonable solution. I'll also just let people know, so GSA is working on another authentication solution. So OMB for years has run a system called max.gov. Max.gov does still today do government-wide authentication using PIV cards, and is in use for the budget systems, which every agency uses to submit their budget. We've had lots of other agencies using it for various things, and that max.gov is being transitioned to GSA. So by the end of next year, GSA is supposed to have stood up a alternative solution, which, as I understand it, is going to be based on Azure Active Directory. That'll be government-wide authentication at a slightly lower price than login.gov is, I think.
Great. All right, Bo, I see your hand raised.
Yep. I kind of agree with what Sam was saying before. It depends on the use case, and there are some considerations agencies need to make. When I was at Census, we do a lot of work with the general public. And so if someone has a login.gov account, it usually makes sense to be able to service that. And we're trying to figure that out. When I was at the Small Business Administration, we dealt obviously with the small business community, and we implemented login.gov as an option there too, and it worked really well. So there are some considerations, but you got to go through that analysis as an agency and really look at the use case that you're satisfying.
Excellent, thank you. And Lawrence, did you have another comment, or your hand's just raised? Oh, okay. All right. I want to direct you all's attention over to the audience Q&A because we had quite a few come in, and I'll just go ahead and start with the first one. Moonwai Han says, Google Authenticator and the like are not considered phishing resistant to MFA. Other than PIV, what other options are there for federal agencies given legacy systems that do not support PIV? So if you have a response to that, you can go ahead and come off mute or raise your hand just to indicate to me that you would like to reply. Dan.
Sure, yeah. I feel like I'm kicking off a lot, so I'll stop after this. But one of the really critical principles in zero trust, especially when you're talking about legacy systems, is this idea of bastion hosts or gateways. So if you're using any authentication provider, if you're using an authentication provider that doesn't support SAML or some other similar protocol, probably you should find a different authentication provider. But once you've got that capability, it's really easy to stand up a proxy server in front of a legacy system that all that proxy server is going to do is validate that the user has been authenticated, that they meet certain criteria levels of trust, and then that proxy can actually confer with your central identity management server to verify that that user should have access to that legacy system. And that mitigates a lot of the risk that comes from running a legacy system that doesn't support stronger authentication methods. So that's one and probably the easiest way to do it. And then of course you want to look at that legacy system and identify a path to upgrade it, whether that's just replacing the authentication module with something more modern, or replacing it altogether. Don't run legacy systems, right?
Thank you.
I'll add to that, Dan. I think the Google Authenticator, Microsoft Authenticator, and the other mainstream authenticators are excellent methods of authentication. And I believe that in the very near future, you'll see these considered phishing resistance. Even today, when we think about phishing in an email context, they are phishing resistant in that context. But the authenticator apps, they pop up a little message that says approve. On your phone, for example, you'll say an attempt has been, there's a login attempt, do you approve? And you just hit that approve button. Super, super simple. The concern around phishing resistance is someone hitting approve when it's not them actually doing the login, right? So you can social engineer that, clicking that approve button. I believe that there's going to be some capabilities added in the very near future that address that concern, or at least shore that up. So I would seriously consider those options now, because they are excellent, generally speaking.
Thank you both. Sam, go ahead.
Yeah, just want to agree with what Bo said. And also for some of the networks, we're also utilizing Duo, and that's been fantastic. And that was one of our concerns for some of these was with the academics adopt, when people not within, and they actually have, absolutely fine, which makes us feel much better than not providing anything at all, even if there is some concern that they're not, firmly established. I think they're great use cases.
Yeah, and if you use the text message version, that's not a good practice, just to be clear with that, right? If you get a text message, you have to type in a number. You don't want to be doing that form of authenticator app.
But I'll also just point out, whether it's Google Authenticator or, any of the other one-time code generating services, or even SMS text messaging, it's far better than nothing. So, you implement the best, strongest security that you can. And then, like we were saying before, just within your systems, you want to make sure that someone has been authenticated with an appropriate level of certainty before giving them access to your most sensitive functions.
All right, thank you. So moving right along to our next audience question from James Payne. He writes in, Zero Trust architecture requires absolute and dynamic identity management of network equipment components, not merely individual identity. Are we making progress in this network identity piece?
So I'll kick this off this time, Dan. No, I'll kick it over to you, Dan. But no, I think we're making progress. I think we're still struggling though, because we're so comfortable with identity as it relates to the individual. So that's kind of our comfort zone. I look at Zero Trust as having so many more tools in your toolbox now, and having so much more flexibility, right? I don't look at it as a rigid sort of friction-prone process. I see it in quite the opposite sense. Identity is obviously important, and multi-factor is critical in that piece of the recipe. But if I also know you're on the device I expect you to be on, that raises my confidence. And if I also know that you're coming from the geographic area that I expect you to come from, then that raises my confidence, right? So through this analysis, I can reduce friction, right? And you see this with your bank. If you ever visit your bank on a new phone or a new laptop, your bank prompts you and says, hey, we haven't seen this before. We're going to add some rigor here, and then we can remember this for next time, right? So that's the model that we're trying to get to. But it's certainly easier said than done, and we are sort of wrestling with those details.
Okay, we'll go Dan and then Jean.
Yeah, I do think a lot of times when people start talking about Zero Trust, one of the mistakes they make is to say, well, I can't consider where something is on the network as a factor, and that's not accurate. What we're saying with Zero Trust is you shouldn't consider that as the only factor, but it is a part of verifying the identity of that system. So if in the case of network components, I can identify, I can say this network component should be on this port of this switch coming through this firewall, right? Those are all components of that servers or that network component's identity that I can consider and verify when I'm deciding how much to trust that piece of my network.
Jean, go ahead.
So yes to all of that. And the other thing there is the MPE certificates. It's not actually being used for many network devices itself, but there is that as part of the solution space for Zero Trust, as well as when you're looking at devices that are on the network. Some of the things that you really need to understand is what are the protocols that that device should be communicating with? Who should it be communicating with? What area of your network should you be coming from, right? Again, so when you're looking down at your network layer, the network doesn't lie. So the data that you're passively collecting off that network actually can do interpretations and insights and actually provide that information up to like your SOC teams and others that actually can show you if there is anonymous things happening on your network, which will help you kind of drill down to verify that you're implementing your zero trust and you're not leaving holes somewhere else in your architecture.
Thank you, Jean. All right, we're going to move right along to the next one. This is from Dave Neisper. Dan, you mentioned your team is developing a system for scoring trust. How far off is that system from launching, and what would happen in the event that a trust score does not align with a particular environment?
Yeah, I mean, the system may be too strong a word. This is an idea that we're starting to develop. We definitely, there is not a single line of code written for this, or even a fleshed out design for it. But the idea is to, the idea we think aligns really well with the principles that zero trust, is trying to get to. And so we're starting with it as an ideal, and we'll see if we're ever actually able to develop a system that really does this in practice. In terms of the other part of the question, I mean, I think like I was saying earlier, what we want to be able to do is, rather than rejecting a request from a user, is tell the user, hey, your trust score isn't high enough for this particular event, and we need you to do something to raise your trust score, and maybe even providing them with a list of options of things that they could do. Whether or not that proves to be feasible or practical is a whole other set of questions.
Thank you, Dan. All right, and then our last audience question for now anyways, Rob Simmons asks, what do the panelists think of the FIDO Alliance specifications, fast identity online for authentication? Any thoughts, Sam?
Yeah, I think it's a great question, and it comes down to, I think, your comfort level and what you want to implement in your applications, because I think, FIDO is also trust over IP. There's similar of these organizations that are really standing up. And I think they all have, if not the same implementation, a similar theory, because there's even, the self-identified, essentially is the method that people are going, where you are your own source, essentially, of authentication, how to put that in control of the user and blockchain-based approach. So, it's one that we've looked at. We haven't fully adopted it, again. So I think these are areas of sort of emerging in this space, so it's one that I don't know if there's an official government position, but it's one that I think many of us within the government are following.
Thank you, Sam. Brian?
I'll echo that. I think it's a great, I guess it's the right direction for us to move. I think you see industry kind of looking at that as well. I share sort of the same optimism that some of the other panelists have, that as industry tools mature, they just keep getting better for us. What I'm not, frankly, anxious to do is to implement new things that we develop on our own without that kind of industry backing. So I'm a fan of what they're trying to achieve. It kind of remains to see how that plays into our overall strategy, but I'm a big fan of not developing stuff.
Thank you, Brian. And Dan, did you want to comment? Or you're just
I
off
would
mute?
just, in the same context as what Brian was just saying, standards based. Any standard is a good standard to start with. Whether it's the FIDO Alliance or SAML or OpenID, implementing identity management using those standards is going to make it easier for you to, leverage, other commercial or service offerings or other government offerings as they come along. So try not to reinvent the wheel, and look at what the industry standards are for that kind of authentication.
Thank you all. All right, moving back to my questions. So we previously discussed monitoring required to ensure that the zero trust principles are being adhered to, like knowing who is accessing what. But Lawrence, maybe you can start us off with this question. Could you expand a little bit more on the value that the network evidence plays into your zero trust architectures?
Well, today, not much, because we've gotten that mature in terms of implementing the technologies across the Department of Commerce. This gets to Gene's point though earlier, that this is as we start to get to enforcement of whatever rules we put in place, and Dan brings up a great concept that I took some notes on related to scoring of individuals or devices. I think that's really good. And I think when you get to those network devices, it's going to help us do those things and provide those kinds of real-time evaluations of scoring of devices or people as they try to traverse or come into a network or traverse a network to actually get to different applications. So, we're just not there yet because of, the investments that haven't come through, but at some point, we are going to get to a point where we're going to need some advanced tools to be able to get to that advanced level of zero trust that we want to get to.
Great, thank you. Anyone else on the panel, would you like to respond to that same question?
Yeah, obviously I like talking.
Go ahead, Dan.
We've had a lot. We haven't done anything with this, so I can't speak to it beyond kind of the theoretical, but we've had a lot of vendors approaching us talking about using AI or big data analytics as a way to analyze network traffic and implement zero trust principles. So, that is, one of the things we're looking for with zero trust is aberrant behavior, right? Anything that is unusual, should play into our consideration. And, artificial intelligence, the term gets thrown around a lot, but big data analytics, real-time big data analytics on your network traffic, on your usage, can help you identify those aberrant trends really, really well. So we haven't implemented anything like that. It's a little bit vaporware for us right now, but there's a lot of vendors out there working on it, and it's an area to watch, something we're excited to see.
Fantastic.
I would just add, sort of to Brian's point earlier, industry is solving this problem, and government is leveraging these industry services. And I won't name any specifically, but there are industry vendors and cloud service providers that are building this visibility into their products. And so in those cases, we can just leverage those tools and capabilities as they're designed, right? And some of this is happening today. Really, the way I view it is, you got the 5 pillars that have laid out sort of the zero trust pillars. You've got the user, you've got the device, you've got the session. Those I view as external aspects. On the other one, you have the application and you have the data. Those are internal. In the middle, you have the policy enforcement point, right? And to really make this come alive, you have to determine on those external elements where you're going to place trust, right? You got the user identity, right? Multi-factor, obviously. You got the device. What specific attributes of that device are we going to identify to place the trust in? And then the same with the session. Geographic location is probably one that comes to mind. And then that policy enforcement point ensures criteria are met before allowing that action to occur. And so again, industry's kind of getting us there. And I think the challenge for the government is being patient and then learning how to adopt these industry tools and capabilities.
Mm-hmm. And Brian, do you have a response as well?
Yeah, I something that Gene said earlier kind of struck a chord with me, which is sort of using the information we have available to us to prove what we're doing. So the policies themselves, it's a tough thing for every application owner, every data owner to be able to establish what they think the right policy is for what you need to prove to have access to their information, to their applications. But I think that we can show specific use cases where we are blocking that kind of access. So we can set sort of that boundary that says, in these cases, we are not going to allow, just sort of generally not going to allow access. In these other cases, here's what you have in terms of flexibility as an application owner, as a data owner, on how to implement that. And I know we historically have had a hard time proving the efficacy of our cybersecurity tooling, and we're going to attempt to do that here later this fall with the pilot that we're implementing on our production networks. So it's a hard problem, but I think it's very real. And then sort of to Dan's points as well, we would love to take advantage of some of that big data and AI ML stuff to ease the hunting burdens that we have on our defensive cyber operators. Right now, industry tells me that they can they can achieve something like 85% automation of the things that we do manually right now. But I would say that our efforts in that space are fairly immature.
Thank you, Brian. All right, next audience question. If you would like to respond, just come off mute or raise your hand. James Payne asks, do the panelists see an enhanced PKI as the means to managing network identity management to get us to true zero trust architecture as urged by OMB memorandum M2209?
I'll start us off. I'm sure someone will jump into, but PKI is critical. And the reason I say that is we've talked about identity and how critical identity is. That certificate-based identity is very, very useful, but not only from an individual standpoint, from a device standpoint as well, right? We have to identify the device under a zero trust model. And again, beyond identifying the device or authenticating the device, rather, we have to determine the other attributes of that device, again, like I was saying before, that we're going to place trust in. And so certificates are certainly important. I don't know that they are absolutely critical, but they are very, very useful and very important and commonly used today. I think people understand them, but the usage of the certificate changes a bit because, again, it's the person plus the device is sort of the foundation, along with the session attributes that are in play as well.
Thank you, Bo. Anyone else? Okay, let's go ahead and pop up our second poll question then, and then I will revert back to my questions. Poll question number 2. Where are you in your zero trust journey? So please respond if you are in your planning phase, some initiatives, significant amount of activity, or no plans. All right, so my next question is around logging. Logging has been and continues to be an important part of a cybersecurity strategy. OMB's M2131 establishes a maturity model for event log management that defines 4 tiers and provides guidance of what should be captured in the logs at each level as agencies strengthen their posture. This is a great first step. So my question, and Brian, maybe you can kick us off with this one. Can you tell us whether you think agencies are using the data being collected effectively within their security operations centers? Or what do you think are important points to highlight regarding this?
So I feel like I'm in a 12-step program here now. What I'll tell you is I think that we are not using it effectively ourselves. I tell our cyber defenders that they're on a data diet. I would say that they somewhere south of 40% of the data that we log is actually being used in a meaningful way in the Department of Defense. And that said, you know, we consume entire data feeds instead of individual data elements that I think we ought to be focusing on. And we, as a result, have a mass amount of data that we can't retain maybe long enough to do the important work that we ought to be doing as well. So you know, I put them on a data diet, and we're trying to establish what things are useful, knowing, of course, that will never be exactly right. We're going to have to change. We're going to have to evolve. We're moving some of our analytics and data storage that is still on-prem to the cloud, which makes a lot of people nervous as well. But frankly, it's the only way for us to afford what we're trying to do in the Department of Defense. So I'll admit that we're not using it effectively at present.
Thank you, Brian. And let's jump over to Sam next.
No, I just want to second what Brian said, and I think also it's difficult because even with the guidance, essentially, you know, how do you utilize it effectively? And there is that tendency that folks absolutely just want to collect everything, and Splunk feeds into that if you're using Splunk because they want to charge you by the amount you're collecting. So it becomes this very expensive proposition where you're collecting a lot of junk that's not necessarily helping you make decisions. You know, so I do think this is an area that we struggle with at NIH. You know, I'm speaking for NCATS, but NIH is one that we haven't necessarily solved in general. And you know, what is the useful data, you know, and how is it actionable? So I do think this is something that an area where industry could help, would love to have industry come in with best practices here, or even some of the vendors to talk about this, because it's just something I think we could really use some help on. I really love Brian's term data diet. I might use that with some of my team, because, what is the minimum we have to collect? Because again, especially not to pick on Splunk here, but Splunk, that, they're making money hand over fist because they just want you to collect everything, but it's not always useful.
Thank you, Sam. We'll do Dan and then Bo.
Yeah, I second everything you just said about Splunk. But at OMB, I inherited from my predecessors a Splunk system that is very well engineered to collect data. It collects lots and lots and lots of data. But I have a background before I was in cybersecurity in database design and data modeling and some of those things. And what we're lacking in Splunk is a useful data model. Is a defined set. When I took over, I asked our Splunk administrator to build me a data dictionary. That was 4 years ago. I still don't have it. And that I think is what we're missing. Building out, when you have a system like Splunk or any SIEM system, building out that data dictionary and building out a logical data model that a human can understand, so that when an analyst wants to go diving for data, they can do so quickly and relatively easily without having to delve into the archaic handwritten notes of whoever set up your Splunk instance. I think that's a really key model. A lot of agencies don't have a chief data officer, but if you do, or you have somebody that kind of fills that role, that's something I would really say is really worthwhile, is getting that person together with your security team and letting them help you kind of organize that data in a way that makes sense.
I'll just add, Dan, logs are such a burden until you have a breach or a compromise. Then they're gold. They're solid gold, right? So that's the problem, right? You only need them when you need them, and then when you need them, you really need them. But it quickly becomes a big data problem, and there's been so many times where we have tons and tons and tons of logs, and then we have a situation we're dealing with. It's like, oh, we have a blind spot there, and it's like so frustrating. So we recently moved away from our on-prem logging solution to a cloud-based SaaS logging solution. And it's much better for us as an agency to maintain. We can maintain it easier than an on-prem solution. The other thing I'll say is, in the cloud, the technology moves fast, and so the AI and the ML is at your fingertips, right? So we're sort of set up to take more advantage of our logs. But as far as effectiveness goes, I stated in terms of maturity. I would assume that most SOCs here can respond to incidents using logs. And so that's effective use of logs, right? But are we getting the most out of it? Probably not, right? So we do have a long way to go. It is big data. I just added a data scientist to my team and the cybersecurity team. And so we're just beginning to kind of chip away at that sort of challenge, that big data challenge.
I don't know if this is a lot, but I actually have kind of a question for the panel. Moving logging in particular to the cloud is something that's pretty high on my list of wishes. But we have a lot of pushback from our general counsel on that. Has anyone else had that problem, and how did you convince them?
We use SaaS all the time, right? All our emails in the cloud today. So I don't know what would be much different when it comes to logs. And again, it's, they're aggregated somewhere. Either you trust your data center or you trust your cloud service provider. What is it, right? I'd be curious to know what their legal concern is regarding that, because it would apply to much more than just logs, I would suspect.
Yeah, agreed. That's why, Dan, what's their specific concern? Because Bo said, I'm assuming many of us, unless you like it, enjoy having an Exchange server and doing it like most of us adopted email for many years, so I'm curious what their specific concern is and how it could potentially be addressed.
Yeah, I probably do not want to walk very far down this road without getting myself in trouble. But I will say, I mean, their concern in general, right, is somebody else getting access to our data without us having an opportunity to weigh in on whether or not that data should be released. So it's more than just being concerned about a breach. It's being concerned about what is that cloud service provider, what is their policy, what are their safeguards, if an internal threat or some legal process is attempting to get access to that data.
So it almost sounds like they're having a problem with SaaS vendors, but they're okay if you manage and put your data in the cloud and you manage it.
Yeah, so we actually internally are not putting any data in the cloud. We're running our own cloud systems on our own hardware, with the idea that eventually someday we would like to go to the cloud. But it's, I think being part of the executive office of the president, being part of the White House,
Yep.
our general counsel legitimately has concerns that probably aren't prevalent at other agencies. So I was hoping there was a magic words you guys had found, but I guess not.
Well, I will say, Dan, I mean, that is a valid concern, especially for your organization. But cloud is very, very mature today. Like 10 years ago, we used to worry about someone getting access to another cloud's tenant, through the fabric of the cloud. Those are fully addressed these days, and that risk no longer exists. So I would probably go so far as to say they couldn't give your data away, even if they wanted to, because they don't have the encryption keys and everything is compartmentalized such that they can't do it. But you should talk to the CSPs about that. But I think they can sort of have that conversation.
All right, let's try and get through these last two panelist questions. So this is it for our audience questions. So this is it for the audience questions before we run out of time. James Payne writes in, OMB Memorandum M2209 urges all agents in order to achieve this goal. And I see Brian's hand up first.
So I'll talk a little bit about what we're implementing with Thunderdome and the enabling technologies we talked about before. But we're implementing Secure Access Service Edge, SASE, as a mechanism for us to understand or consolidate information about the user from the ICAM, from the device. We're going to eliminate some of the virtual private networking access to applications. We're going to pair that up with application security stacks and SD-WAN technologies to try to limit the east-west kind of movement across the network. But I guess the one thing I want to say on that, I think we are accelerating. We're doing the right things, and we're asking the question about whatever else we're doing in the space, especially of networks and cybersecurity. What should that look like in a zero trust way? And getting kind of brutal about maybe what we stopped doing in the old think and where we go in the future. But I honestly don't actually like the term zero trust because I do think it is a journey. I think it's progressively less trust. It's trust that is based on information and policies, not just blanket trust, which is where many of us were when we started these journeys. And so I think everybody should think about it that way. And I can't remember who said it earlier, but hey, these tools are better than nothing, and that should be part of it. Is what is the low-hanging fruit? What is the first step we take to make that move towards zero trust and just continue to evolve in an agile fashion? That's what we really have to do. But if you think a vendor is going to sell you zero trust, or if you think you're going to buy that in some other way, you don't understand what zero trust is supposed to be.
Lawrence?
Yeah, I'm just in it. Actually, you kind of stole my thunder there at the end, Brian, about this agile process of implementing zero trust. It is, you can't buy it like you said. It's like almost like you're delivering a software application or a capability. Let's look at it that way. And there are multiple ways of cracking a nut. Multiple ways of skinning a cat or building a mousetrap in terms of achieving the premise or the concept of zero trust in different federal agencies based on what their technologies are. So obviously there's no one-stop shop for how to go about doing that. But one of the things, so how do you escalate that, or how you speed that up? Or one is, first of all, getting everybody on board. And I think that what we've been doing at the Department of Commerce is really, and I'll give some compliments to our CISO, Ryan Higgins here, who has developed some strong organizational teams where he's actually has work groups meeting on a weekly basis between these large bureaus like Census and NIST and NOAA, and coming to a shared understanding of what Zero Trust looks like at the department. And so we're not going down, multiple, 10 or 12 paths, but one path toward achieving Zero Trust at the Department of Commerce. So that's one thing. But the second thing, and this is more of a critique now, this is where we get one of these mandates for accelerating without funds to actually, support that. So we have put in NEF funding, or which is a kind of like a technology modernization fund for us to actually use some cyber relief funding to achieve that. But that's still under works. It's still underway right now, going through the approval process for the OMB, because these things are expensive, and we just can't say, okay, you guys got to go faster without understanding it and realizing and putting some funds behind what it would take to actually truly allow us to accelerate. That's it.
Thank you, Lawrence. And Sam, go ahead.
Yeah, just quick comment on that. I agree 100% with Lawrence. And even that first poll question, I was looking for the answer, all of the above, but a big answer there is really the lack of funding, for some of these is we're doing our best to accelerate, but you can't accelerate if you have a car with no gas or electricity, depending upon what you're driving these days. So I think many folks are dipping their toes in and we are moving, but there is a lack of funding, but there's also a lack of expertise. I think that's part of it too, and that ties to hiring, is especially within the federal space, it's very difficult for us to compete with industry to hire the folks that we need in some cases too. So multiple problems to it. So just really glad that Lawrence raised that point.
Yeah, thank you. And then the last question that we'll just briefly answer is from Jeff Bond. What potential changes are on the horizon for compliance frameworks and ATOs to handle the inherent dynamism of ZTA? And do you imagine that these changes will be made in our lifetimes? So if a panelist or two could respond to that. Dan, did you want to respond?
Yeah, I'm happy to. I also just wanted to say, in regards to the last question, so the TMF Technology Modernization Fund is a real thing that agencies should definitely be looking towards in order to fund their zero trust, their zero trust projects. OMB is applying for TMF funding for our own projects. So, even we are. In terms of the changes, I think programs like FedRAMP are, at least an attempt by the government to streamline, implementation of cloud services and software as a service, and to try and reduce some of the burden on agencies to implement those kinds of capabilities. I think you'll see more programs like that. And I know that, like I said, I am not part of the OFCIO, but Max.gov is a FedRAMP cloud service provider, and as the security officer for Max.gov, I've spent a fair amount of time on both sides of the FedRAMP fence as a cloud service provider and also as an agency consuming their services. So I know I've had lots of conversations with the PMO there, and there's a lot being done to try and continue to enhance and improve that service. So I think those are the kinds of changes that we're going to see within the federal government, at least. And yeah, I do think that we'll see significant changes like that within our lifetimes. I'm optimistic about it.
Thank you, Dan. And Lawrence, did you want to respond?
Yeah, just really quick. One of the things that's happening right away is as the authorizing official for the Office of the Secretary, any new applications that come with that need to be authorized, I'm not going to allow them to get their ATO certification unless they comply with our ICAM solution. And that's going to be a thing coming up right away. And that's going to be a big challenge because it's one great big application that a department-wide application they're expecting to go live and they say, oh, the ICAM thing can wait later. No, you do it now. And so those are things that, that have a direct impact in terms of zero trust right now. That's going to change right away. And we'll be putting that into policy in short order.
Thank you, Lawrence. And then Sam, comment quickly.
Yeah, real quick, just for Jeff's question, I think that's one area, and I'm glad what Dan said with regards to FedRAMP and the FedRAMP PMO. One thing we're seeing more of too is trying to get vendors that have gone through FedRAMP help other vendors if they're not in a competitive space, because I think this is an area that, many vendors are reluctant because they don't know the cost, they don't know the process, but they can learn from one another. So we've been having some, we've done some arranged marriages where, with non-competitive, vendors that have gone through the process. And I think that does help accelerate it. Because I do agree, with Jeff's question, it is a glacial pace sometimes. So hopefully it's within our lifetime, Jeff. I'm optimistic like with Dan.
Wow, thank you all. Great question. All right, I'm going to call for our third and final poll question for anyone who would like to receive their CPE credit. Go ahead and respond to that. And while that is up, because I like everyone to be able to have a final word, I would like to go around and hear from each of our panelists around just one key takeaway, 30 seconds or less. But based off this entire conversation, what do you want to leave our audience with? And we will go ahead and start that with Sam, please.
Yeah, just the comments that were said. Thanks for being on this panel, but also something's better than nothing. And I think that's something that, within the government, we lose track of sometimes. They feel like we have to have the answer before, especially, part of this, it's experimentation phase with some of these things. And so it's better to have something in place than nothing at all.
I love that. Thank you. Something is better than nothing. Thank you, Sam. And we will move along to Jean next.
I think what you've heard is each of the agencies are taking Zero Trust seriously, and they're starting their path toward it. And no one believed that it was going to be an overnight solution. So applauds to everybody who's doing that.
Jean. Each agency is on their way. Okay, Dan, let's hear from you.
Thanks. Thanks so much for having this panel. I really enjoyed the conversation, and my fellow panelists. Thanks, everyone. I think that the one thing that I would hope people to take away from this is Zero Trust is a journey, and you want to be looking to implement pieces of it or move towards it in any case that you can. Try and look at every problem and see if there is a zero trusty kind of answer to it. And you'll be surprised over time how much progress you can make without doing a big overall re-architecture.
Wonderful. Thank you, Dan. And right along to Bo next.
Yeah, a couple of quick thoughts. One, like I said before, Zero Trust is very flexible, right? But with that flexibility comes sophistication, or complexity. So we really got to have our wits about us as we move down this path. The other thing is, a good measure that you can use for Zero Trust is to ask yourself, would this prevent an unauthorized user from my internal network, right? Someone that's already inside your network, would this prevent them from accessing a resource? And a simple way to look at it is, well, if we govern the device they're on, maybe so, right? We might have a chance of defeating an authenticated user on our internal network. So that's my takeaway.
Yeah, thank you. That's great. And we will jump next to Lawrence, please.
So I look at this as some of the biggest failures of IT projects are always in the, trying to do too much too soon. So when you're talking about implementing the HR system or financial system, those are big projects that fail often. And it's because we try to do too much, or we haven't herded those cats in terms of, getting people to agree to a certain set of standards. So my point here is that, again, with, as you said earlier, multiple technologies can do this. But where these things will succeed or fail is getting everybody on the same page about what things we're going to do and what things we're going to do together. It's like, those axioms, you can go fast if you go by yourself, but we can go far if we go together. And that's what needs to happen with Zero Trust. You can go very far. We can do so many more things. And as an enterprise, particularly a large enterprise, take one big step together. That is the best thing you can do in terms of securing your future with Zero Trust architecture.
Great. Well said. Thank you. And Brian, we'll end with you.
So I appreciate the opportunity to be here with you. Appreciate the excellent views of all the other panelists as well. I would say that kind of continuing the theme of take the first step towards Zero Trust, or take the next step if you're already on your way. Take a look at the pillars. Evaluate yourself on where you stand in the maturity of those capabilities, but we all may have different sort of value propositions associated with different parts of Zero Trust. And so it might be appropriate, because you're you're due to tech refresh some legacy capability that you had in place from a cybersecurity perspective, that should be the thing that you start with then. So just don't renew that. Kind of the idea that you enforce, applications using ICAM and things like that. There's lots of steps that you can take without a huge zero trust program. If you just look at the things that we've always done in the context of how would that be done in a modern way with zero trust. So I think everybody has the ability to get started, but it does introduce a resource contention because we limited staff. We have to keep a lot of the legacy stuff in place as we're making these transitions. So sometimes, there's a dual operations cost as we get started, but then ideally we should see a value proposition on the back end as well.
Well said. Thank you. Thank you to all of our panelists. Of course, this has just been a great discussion. I like how everybody was willing to just jump in there. And I want to thank our audience at home, of course, for sending in such great questions for our panelists. Our final poll is just whether you would like to have your CPE credit certificate emailed to you or not. So take a moment to please respond to that. And of course, I need to thank our partners at CoreLight for helping us put together today's event. So our next event is up on the screen now. And if you want to go ahead and register for that, it's free. It is ATARC's Health IT Virtual Summit taking place on July 12th. So go ahead and register for that one. And I look forward to seeing you at the next. I hope everyone has a great rest of your week. Talk to you soon.